Very good. Are we good to go, everyone? Very good. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Congressman Jim Langevin. Sorry that we had a little bit of a delay and some technical difficulties, so I'll be joining you by voice only. I'm told you my photo will be up as I'm speaking. So sorry we couldn't join you visually as well, but I hope everyone is doing well and getting through these challenging times that we are all dealing with right now. And I'm confident we will get through this, but get through it together. But I want to welcome everyone to today's virtual forum titled Coronavirus and Homeland Security Part 2, Elections and Integrity During the Pandemic. Special thanks to our panelists, Lee Chapman and Wendy Weiser, for being here today, and also proud to be on the call with my colleague, Representative Underwood, who will be speaking right after me and giving some opening remarks. And so with that, uh, the right of the American people to select local, state, and federal leaders is fundamental to our nation's democracy. Today, our experts will discuss the challenges COVID-19 presents to voters and election officials this year, illustrate how voting may look different than in previous elections, and explore policies that could increase the safety and security of upcoming elections. Before we dive in, let me briefly provide a backdrop for today's discussion. Over 1.5 million cases of COVID-19 have been in the country, unfortunately. And heartbreakingly, we have lost over 100,000 Americans to the virus. No vaccine or national testing strategy right now is in sight. And in all 50 states, District of Columbia, and the U.S. territories are reopening public places with a presidential election season quickly approaching. At the same time, longstanding racial injustice has led to protests in more than a dozen cities. Although these protests developed organically, officials are investigating whether foreign actors are using disinformation to exacerbate these social tensions, to sow division and undermine confidence in our democratic process, much like they did in the past two elections. So it goes without saying that the 2020 election season will look unlike any other in American history, especially if, as predicted by the director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Robert Redfield, we in fact do have a second wave, which is more devastating wave of infections this fall. The reality of the public health emergency we face requires us to rethink how Americans can vote safely and securely. Issues of voter access and cybersecurity are colliding with physical safety concerns, particularly for at-risk populations. Additionally, online voting efforts, while appealing on the surface, could compromise the integrity of voting, reduce voter access, and undermine voter confidence if implemented without proper planning and security. Now, the administration needs to step up to address these issues, but Congress has a role to play too. Tomorrow, the Cyber Solarium Commission, which I'm a member, will release a white paper detailing the similarities between the pandemic and a major cyber incident, and highlighting solarium recommendations that are particularly relevant during this public health emergency. I'm incredibly grateful to Speaker Pelosi for appointing me to the commission, the meetings of which have been some of the most rewarding activities I've engaged in as a member of Congress. And I'm also deeply appreciative of Chairman Thompson and Chairman Richmond for lending their support to these efforts. In the pandemic index, the commissioners highlight the need for immediate investments to ensure that we have secure offline remote voting options. We also underscore the need for increased civics and media literacy education to help Americans cut through the foreign disinformation campaigns being waged by our adversaries. I strongly look forward to a robust discussion today on how the panelists view these recommendations and how we can work together to support voters and election officials this year. while assuring public health, election security, and voter access remain intact. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists and have them give opening remarks. And uh, I understand that I'm going to be introducing Ms. Weiser to give her an opportunity to give 3-minute remarks, and then Representative Underwood will introduce Ms. Chapman for her opportunity and have an opportunity to give remarks there, as I understand it. So our first panelist is Ms. Wendy Weiser, the Vice President, Democracy at the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University School of Law. There, she directs the democracy program, which focuses on voting rights and elections, money in politics and ethics, redistricting and representation, and government dysfunction, rule of law, and fair courts. Quite a list of subjects in your portfolio there. So with that, I want to thank you for joining us, Ms. Weiser. The floor is now yours.
Thank you so much, Representative Langevin and Underwood, for hosting this really important forum on the security and integrity of our elections during the pandemic. I am going to address 3 security threats, and in 5 minutes, I hope. And by far the biggest security threat to our election this November is the coronavirus, and the threat that our nation's election administrators will not be prepared to run a safe, accessible, secure, and credible election in the midst of a pandemic. Too many Americans have already died from the virus, and public health experts expect a resurgence this fall. To protect health and to ensure fair and secure elections, we are seeing and we are going to see substantial changes to how we run elections this year. First and foremost, states will need to prepare for significant surges in absentee and mail voting and ensure that every eligible voter can vote by mail ballot if they want one. They will also need to ensure that everyone has access to safe and accessible polling places, including by extending early voting, that every voter has remote access to voter registration, and that there are adequate cybersecurity measures and plans in place, among other things. And whether or not any election rules change between now and November, there will still be significant changes to how Americans vote, because most Americans already are entitled to an absentee or mail ballot, and more are choosing that option this year, overwhelming election offices. In Wisconsin, for example, 62% of voters chose to vote absentee in the primary, up from 6% in the 2018 general election. In Nebraska, a whopping 85% of voters did. Election officials are working hard to make the changes needed, but the bottom line is that most are not yet prepared to run a pandemic election. They don't have the infrastructure, the equipment, the staffing they need to run elections with so many mail ballots. They don't have the resources to protect the health and safety of voters, election workers at polling sites and election offices, let alone to enhance election security. They will not be prepared unless they get a substantial infusion of resources soon. And I view this as a critical election and security issue. At the most basic level, the lack of preparedness can threaten the health security of the American public, risking dangerous spreading of the virus. But unpreparedness could also undermine the security of our democratic institutions. As our intelligence agencies report, the main goal of our foreign adversaries is to undermine the legitimacy of our elections. But if we can't manage to run a credible and fair election, we will do their work for them. During the primaries, we've already seen glimpses of the problems that could be magnified in November. Large-scale breakdowns in our election systems and voter disenfranchisement could undermine Americans' confidence in the election and open the door to attacks on the legitimacy of American government and democracy. We can't allow this to happen. States and local election officials need support right now to protect our election. We estimate this will cost roughly $4 billion or $3.6 billion over what Congress has already allocated. And that is a small price to pay for the health of our democracy and our public. The second major threat is the risk of foreign interference and malicious attacks on our election infrastructure, and especially cyber attacks. The risks that were revealed in 2016 have not gone away. All U.S. intelligence and law enforcement agencies have warned that our foreign adversaries are still actively seeking to undermine our institutions and that American elections remain vulnerable to attack. The coronavirus has introduced new vulnerabilities and exacerbated old ones. For example, many election officials are working at home, remotely accessing voter registration databases and other election systems, which poses significant new security risks. The virus has also exacerbated the risks of attack to our voter registration systems. You will recall that in 2016, Russian operatives targeted the voter registration databases in all 50 states. In several states, they actually successfully penetrated systems, and at least one, they were able to be in a position to delete or change data. Attacks on voter registration systems could have an even more devastating effect this year, given how central those systems are to administering absentee and mail voting. And attacks on online registration systems could also prevent people from registering and worse. So, to protect against these threats, too, election officials need resources. And the third and last threat I'm going to mention is the significant threat that the election is going to be marred by disinformation and fear mongering about voter fraud. Our national security experts warn that a key tactic that Russia and other foreign adversaries are deploying to attack our elections is spreading disinformation online. All of these changes that we're seeing in our election system because the pandemic make voters more vulnerable to disinformation, including lies that might prevent them from voting. So, a significant investment in public education is key. We also have a disinformation threat from within our country, a public relations campaign to undermine confidence in the integrity of America's absentee and mail ballot systems. Claims that these systems are rife with fraud are just plain false. They are also damaging to our democracy. They may cause vulnerable Americans to avoid absentee ballots, risking their lives. They may justify unfair measures to restrict access to votings. They undermine confidence in our election system and our standing in the world as a leading democracy as a result. And if Americans don't trust our election outcomes, it would really strike to the heart of our system, which depends on trust in our elections and peaceful transitions of power. Americans need to understand that our absentee and mail voting systems are secure, and that if we want to increase the overall security of our elections, we need to act quickly to ensure that our state and local election officials have the resources they need to run the election and to employ the state-of-the-art security measures. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ms.
Very
Weiser,
good.
and
Thank
good
you
afternoon.
Good afternoon, Laura. My apologies, first of all. I should have yielded to my colleague, Lauren Underwood, first, so I apologize for that, but want to do so. Lauren Underwood is the vice chair of the subcommittee, and so I yield to you next.
Well, thank you, Mr. Langevin. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Congresswoman Lauren Underwood, the Vice Chair on the House Homeland Security Committee. I'd like to thank Mr. Langevin for hosting today's virtual roundtable, where we will be discussing election security and integrity during the coronavirus pandemic. Securing our elections is a major concern for my constituents in Illinois, where the personal information of 76,000 voters was accessed by Russian operatives in 2016. We already knew that we urgently needed to invest in our election infrastructure to protect our democracy. Now, on top of these pre-existing threats, we're also facing an unprecedented situation where the physical safety of voters and poll workers themselves are at risk. As a public health nurse, I was horrified by the impossible choice that Wisconsin voters faced in their recent primary, where people were forced to either risk their own lives or give up their fundamental rights as citizens of a democracy. Unfortunately, the threat that this pandemic poses to our elections goes beyond physical endangerment. We've already seen efforts by foreign adversaries to take advantage of this crisis by spreading dangerous falsehoods about the disease. We must prepare for disinformation campaigns that could undermine public confidence in an electoral process that looks different than what people are used to, as Ms. Weiser just outlined. The integrity of our elections is essential to the preservation of our republic, especially after the last week, when it's been painfully clear all over this country that all voices are not always heard. It's our patriotic duty to make sure that every voice is heard and every vote is counted. Election security is national security, and I look forward to working with my colleagues on this committee to protect it, whether that means preventing foreign interference and conducting safe and accessible elections during a pandemic. I'm so glad that we're being joined today by these two distinguished experts, Wendy Weiser and Lee Chapman, who can share these key insights from their research on this topic, and to assist our committee as we chart a path forward. Now, with that being said, I'd like to welcome my friend, Ms. Lee Chapman, to the panel. Ms. Chapman is the director of the Voting Rights Program at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Prior to joining the Leadership Conference, she was a senior policy advisor at Let America Vote, where she advised the organization on election law and policy issues at the state and federal levels. Previously, she served as director of policy for the Pennsylvania Department of State. She has experience in advancing democracy issues for nonprofit organizations, state government, and through litigation. And we're so very glad to have her on the panel today. Ms. Chapman, thank you for joining us, and I invite you to share your initial thoughts on this important topic.
Thank you so much, Representatives Langevin and Underwood, for convening today's important panel to discuss how we can work together to expand access to the ballot box and fortify our democracy in 2020. You know, voting is the language of American democracy. The ability to participate in civic life, to have a voice in choosing the elected officials whose decisions impact our lives, families, and communities. That's at the core of what it means to be an American. But today, some leaders, even during this pandemic, are still working to silence people who are historically denied access to the ballot box. Just a few months ago, the nation witnessed the sacrifices that Wisconsin primary voters were forced to make in order to cast their ballot. Politicians refused to allow the primary to be postponed, which made thousands of voters have to choose between their right to vote and their health and safety. Not surprisingly, dozens of individuals were likely infected at Wisconsin polling places, according to press reports. Another sad reality of the Wisconsin primary was the racial disparity in voter turnout. The Leadership Conference's All Voting is Local campaign, together with DEMOS, conducted an analysis of the Wisconsin primary that revealed stark racial disparities and troubling patterns in voter turnout. The data showed that wards with higher Black and Hispanic populations had significantly lower voter turnout compared to wards with a higher percentage of white residents. On the issue of election security, the Leadership Conference is in the process of drafting a report with the organization Verified Voting, which will highlight how voting technology impacts access at the ballot box for voters of color. Our findings will highlight how the choice of voting technology, the age of voting systems, and the allocation of resource disparities can lead to long lines and voter disenfranchisement. For example, as some of you may remember, during the Texas primary on March 3rd, voters at Texas Southern University, a historically Black college and university, stood in line for over 6 hours to cast their ballot because there were too few voting machines due to breakdowns. The Leadership Conference has 3 top priorities to safeguard our democracy in 2020. The first one is working with Congress and states to expand voting options. Second, ensuring the next congressional relief package includes election assistance. And third, informing and activating people to vote in November. There are just a few things I want to underscore today. The first thing is that voters need options this year to vote. Voting by mail is a great option, and it should be easy and accessible for eligible voters. But while vote by mail must be a key part of the election response plan, voters must also have a clear range of options to safely cast their ballots this year. Focusing exclusively on vote by mail could disenfranchise voters of color, Native Americans, people with disabilities, non-English speakers, students, low-income families, and people experiencing homelessness. There is no one panacea for elections during a pandemic. That's why, to ensure full voter access, states should, at a minimum, expand vote by mail, establish safe in-person polling places, extend early voting periods, and expand online voter registration. Second, I want to make a point about congressional funding, and Wendy Weiser touched on this during her remarks. Preparing for upcoming primaries and the November election is a massive undertaking that will require sufficient funding. Congress passed a relief package in March, but the bill fell woefully short of safeguarding our democracy. lawmakers approved only $400 million for state election assistance. And the Leadership Conference and more than 150 organizations sent a letter to Congress urging members to secure an additional $3.6 billion in emergency funding for safe and fair elections. We are grateful to the House of Representatives for its recent passage of the HEROES Act, which allocates the $3.6 billion to states to make the changes and updates that are going to make it possible for every eligible voter to cast a ballot and have it counted. We will work as hard as we can with our coalition and Congress to ensure that these provisions remain in the final bill. And finally, it's going to take an enormous voter education effort this summer and fall to ensure Americans are informed about their options to vote safely in November. That includes fighting disinformation and voter suppression content on social media and other platforms. This also means that voting rules must be widely distributed to the public in advance of elections. Civil rights groups are also united on this front. We are working in coalition to lobby Congress, organize secretaries of state, and work with state and local electeds and organizations to get rule changes in place and keep voters informed. While the pandemic will limit traditional GOTV organizing this year, civil rights groups are creatively engaging in grassroots and grasstops efforts to advance the work digitally. So thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have for me today.
Very good. Thank you, Ms. Chapman, for those remarks, as well as Ms. Weiser. I appreciate both of you and sharing your thoughts with us today. Let me start with a couple of questions. I'll start with Ms. Weiser, and then I'll yield to Congresswoman Underwood. So first, Ms. Weiser, Congress recently appropriated over $800 million in supplemental election security grant funding. And the House recently passed the HEROES Act, which includes $3.6 billion more in election security and integrity measures. So the Senate is yet to act on that package. We hope that they will, at least if they don't amend the HEROES Act, that they will come up with their own package that would include funding for election security. But what do you think are the most impactful ways election officials can utilize an injection of federal funding to secure the 2020 elections and our election infrastructure?
Well, thank you so much for that question. It is absolutely critical that Congress pass that federal funding in the HEROES Act in short order if we want to have a safe, fair, and secure election this fall. We have our estimates are based on detailed interviews with election officials and election vendors across the country that the $400 million that Congress has allocated is only a tiny fraction of a small fraction of what the states actually need. That the real number is $4 billion. We recently, working with the R Street Institute, the Alliance for Securing Democracy, and the University of Pittsburgh Institute for Cyber Law, did a detailed cost analysis in 5 states: Georgia, Michigan, Missouri, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, to look at what are the total changes that are needed in those states to run a secure and fair election this November, working with their election officials. And we found that the total cost of the changes in those 5 states exceeded $400 million, the total amount that was allocated to the whole country. Georgia, for example, received less than 10% of what it needs. $11 million out of a budget hole of between $110 and $124 million. So election officials across the country agree that more resources are needed. We've had multiple election official state associations. More than 150 individual local election officials have written to Congress asking for these resources, and time is running out to ensure that these resources can make a difference. We recently just issued a report looking at the deadlines for running safe elections, and we're finding that the deadlines for using these funds and making the needed expenditures are rapidly approaching. For example, states that want to expand their online voter registration capacity or have online mail ballot application systems, they need to have already begun the process in May in order to have it ready for the surge time that happens in the late summer. For ballot printing, orders should be made this month and certainly no later than July. The longer we wait, the fewer options that are going to be available to state and local election administrators. And those key expenditures are going to be the expenditures to increase online registration and other forms of remote communication capacity. We've already seen registration rates drop dramatically across the country. There have been, I mean, really remarkable. Government offices have shuttered, and malls, fairs, and other large gatherings with people avoiding them. There are no voter registration drives functioning. And we've seen in Kentucky, for example, 7,000 new registrations in February, but only 500 in March. In Virginia, there were 73% fewer registrations in April of this year compared to April in 2016, and so on across the country. We are going to dramatically need to expand the capacity of online voter registration systems, and where they don't exist, to create that capacity and other ways that voters can remotely access voter registration if they don't have online access. And that's going to cost tens of millions of dollars. It takes months to build, but that's going to be critical. We're going to need to see expenditures to increase the capacity of absentee and mail voting. We've seen already the strains that the existing that are being placed on the existing capacity from the primary elections alone. We are expecting that, and we've seen long lines, we've seen at the polls, we've seen ballots lost, not delivered on time. And this is with about half of the turnout that's expected in November. And there are significant racial disparities in how these problems are falling across the country. And so we're going to need to see significant investment right now in tools to actually enable election officials to manage these surge and absentee ballots. Absentee ballot application tools, sufficient number of absentee ballot applications and printed ballots and ballot kits. We're going to need them to have mail sorting equipment, scanning machines, letter openers, staff to process these, and education and outreach. I'll just two other quick things I'll note. It will be critical that we're going to need to invest in safe and healthy polling places this fall. And that is also whether the polling places themselves, to maintain the safety of both poll workers and the public, require significant new investment in personal protective equipment, plexiglass sneeze guards, supplies for marking the machines. We're going to ensure adequate social distancing. We're going to need to expend for expanding early voting, moving to bigger polling places, expanding curbside voting. We'll need significant investment in poll workers. We're going to need more of them, and they'll need to be paid more. And as we know, poll worker shortages were one of the principal reasons that we had all the massive polling place closures this spring in Wisconsin that were really crushing in that state. The other major expense categories, of course, are the big cybersecurity and resilience ones, and the massive public education needs and needs to combat disinformation. So these are all, it's a huge amount that we need to do. We have a short period of time to do it, and we really can't wait any longer if we don't want to see significant meltdowns this November and large-scale disenfranchisement.
All great points. All great points. Thank you for that. Let me ask this next one. The recently passed HEROES Act included grants to states for conducting risk limiting audits, results of elections, up to $20 million. And the Brennan Center has studied these kinds of audits and concluded that they are, I quote, smart and effective tool available to election officials. So I'm proud to say that Rhode Island has the first risk limiting audit put in place by statute in the country. Could you describe the value, in your view, of risk limiting audits and their particular importance now, especially as state and local officials quickly develop new voter systems over the next few months?
Absolutely. It has long been understood by election security experts that Audits are critical to maintaining a secure election. We have been moving across the country to ensure that every state has a voter verified paper trail that can be audited and confirmed after the election. But the risk limiting audits are a special form of audit that provides a simple way to confirm whether or not the voting machines are recording and tallying the votes correctly. It involves hand counting a statistically meaningful sample of the votes cast to determine whether the original vote tally was correct. And the size of the sample varies depending based on statistical principles, depending on how big the margin is. If there's a very large margin, you need only a tiny sample. If it's a smaller margin, you'll need to count more ballots. And the beauty of the risk limiting audits is that they are very efficient and more efficient than traditional audits in allowing election officials to confirm the accuracy of the election by looking at the smallest number of ballots possible to do so. They are effective in that they provide statistical certainty that the outcome is correct or not. Traditional audits actually don't answer the question of whether the reported winner has really won. And this is now the gold standard. It's been endorsed by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, Medicine, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, cybersecurity experts, election officials, and so forth. And it's being piloted across the country. And it is especially important, as you know, Congressman, this year, as there are so many changes to our election system and so many new vulnerabilities that we check and double check to make sure that we have confidence in the accuracy of our election result. Americans are also being primed right now to be worried about the election outcomes, and this should be able to give election officials and American confidence that the winner is in fact the winner, and that it is and that the election's been secure.
Very good. Thank you for those perspectives, those answers. I have more questions, but I'm going to stop the. I'm going to yield to my colleague, Congresswoman Underwood, for questions that she may have now.
Thank you so much. Ms. Chapman, as you know, in 2013, the Supreme Court invalidated key provisions of the Voting Rights Act that for decades had protected voters in states with histories of voting discrimination. Now, in the absence of federal enforcement of voting rights, too many states are making it harder for people to vote. What can Congress do to protect the right to vote in these states and limit voter suppression efforts heading into the election?
Great, thank you so much for that important question. What Congress should do now is to pass H.R. 4, the Voting Rights Advancement Act. That bill passed the House last year, but it is currently in the Mitch McConnell legislative graveyard in the Senate. H.R. 4 would reinstate a preclearance system that was gutted by the Supreme Court in Shelby County versus Holder in 2013, and it would prevent states from enacting discriminatory voting practices. Before Shelby County versus Holder, states with a history of discrimination or lower voter turnout had to obtain pre-approval for any proposed elections change to a federal body before implementing it. Now states can act without any federal oversight. And as a result, we've seen over half the country pass discriminatory photo ID laws, gerrymander districts to silence Black and brown voices, and cut reforms that we know helped voters turn out at higher rates. With H.R. 4, the Voting Rights Advancement Act in place, we can prevent voter registration purges that affect hundreds of thousands, if not millions of voters, all because they may have missed an election or two. We can prevent implementation of photo ID laws that we know disproportionately prevent voters of color and younger voters from casting ballots. We can prevent jurisdictions from reducing the level of language assistance provided to citizens at the polls. We can prevent gerrymandering that dilutes Black and brown votes. We can prevent the elimination of polling places, particularly in communities of color. And we can prevent any additional requirements and documentation, like citizenship paperwork that many just don't have access to current registration requirements. So in short, with federal protections, we can ensure that voting remains free, fair, and accessible. We could stop bad practices from seeing the light of day and encourage states and other jurisdictions to take on strong reforms that help every eligible voter cast a ballot. And also, Congress can also conduct oversight on the issue of how to safeguard voting rights during the pandemic And we appreciate today's panel, which does just that. And we're also grateful to the House Judiciary Committee and House Administration Committee, which are holding hearings on this issue later this week.
Thank you, Ms. Chapman. And now for both panelists, last week, Twitter labeled President Trump's tweets related to vote by mail as misinformation and posted a warning label on one of his tweets directing users to more accurate information. This was the first time that Twitter has exercised their new misinformation policy in relation to a tweet by the president. Do you believe that these companies have adequately prepared for and responded to the flood of misinformation during this pandemic? And are they ready to respond to misinformation about the 2020 election? And if not, what do they need to be doing differently? And then, just related to COVID in general, do you have any thoughts about what the social media platforms have been doing and the roles that these platforms might play with election-related misinformation in 2020? And we can start with Ms. Weiser. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I know that Ms. Chapman has a lot to say about this. I'll start with, I'll make 2 points. The first point I did want to make is that I think it was absolutely right for there to be a correction posted on the tweets trying to sow distrust in our absentee and mail ballot systems in America. It is, this is something that, as I noted in my opening remarks, poses significant threats to American safety and to our democracy. And mail voting in America is secure. Absentee mail ballots are not new. They've long been embedded in our election system. Millions of Americans, 31 million in the last federal election, have voted using that. And exhaustive investigations have found that fraud is incredibly rare. And I can talk more about that afterwards. But this was an appropriate corrective. I think that the critical test for the platforms is going to be with misinformation that is specifically targeting voters and trying to suppress them, as we know, is going to be one of the principal tactics that our foreign adversaries and maybe even some domestic bad actors are going to use to try to interfere in the election. And there are some clear proactive steps that they can and should take. They should be proactively providing accurate information about how to vote and partnering with election officials to do so. They should have clear channels to report disinformation and to monitor and take it down immediately when it happens, especially disinformation about the time, place, and manner of voting, which can be so damaging and which has been spiking in recent years since this flood of online disinformation. That they should be providing corrective information whenever there is any disinformation to anybody who may have received the disinformation. And they should be notifying election officials of any piece of disinformation that relates to their voters, and do so in real time so they too can take steps to ensure that that doesn't interfere in the election. These are proactive steps that need to be put in place now. And the platforms are critically responsible and uniquely positioned to be able to do that. I would say that election officials also have a role to play here in both detecting, responding to, and correcting disinformation. And we can talk about that as well.
Thank you. Ms. Chapman?
Yes, I agree with everything that Wendy just mentioned. After Twitter made its decision, the leadership conference actually issued a statement applauding their actions, but also saying that other social media companies, including Facebook, need to do the same and need to follow suit. And it's critical that these social media companies take voter suppression and misinformation and disinformation seriously. And as it's posted, that they remove it or post corrective information immediately. And the leadership conference and our coalition has been pushing on these social media platforms to have strong policies to moderate content that is voter suppression since the 2016 election. And we saw that African Americans were targeted by foreign actors and also domestic actors as well. But on the point of absentee ballot and mail voting, I just wanted to say that, you know, um, these claims that absentee ballot voting is fraudulent is really a scare tactic, plain and simple, and that individuals and vote suppressive groups are making these claims to deter states from adopting practices and reforms, such as vote by mail, that actually make voting more accessible. And we should be in the business of making voting more accessible for everyone in the country. Opponents of our democracy have been making these claims with the intent of keeping specific populations, people of color, primarily Black and Brown voters, from participating and having their votes count. And it's a way to keep Black and Brown voters down and out of the process. And we don't stand for that. And the Leadership Conference and our coalition are doing anything and everything we can to get that information off of of the social media platforms.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Okay, very good. I think I've joined by video now. I don't know if you've seen me on there. Can you hear me okay?
We see you.
Very good. We got the technical difficulties worked out. So let me, if I could go back on another topic. The last month, CISA with the FBI, NIST, and the EAC produced guidelines for electronic ballot delivery. In those guidelines, CISA generally advised against internet voting because it was a high-risk activity, quote unquote, but fell short of discouraging the practice directly. While I understand that online voting appears attractive during a nationwide pandemic, security experts consistently raise concerns about the potential for online voting to be tampered with at scale. What has the Brennan Center found as it has studied the risk and security related to using online platforms to deliver and cast ballots?
Well, thank you so much for that question. And as tempting as using online systems for voting may be at this time, and we are looking at every possible way to increase remote access to the voting process, it is the Brennan Center's position that it is simply not secure at this point, and the risk will significantly outweigh the benefit. Leading experts in cybersecurity, computer science, and election infrastructure agree that current technology cannot guarantee a secure and reliable voting online. There have been some states that have experimented with internet-based voting platforms only to abandon them because of security vulnerabilities and ballooning implementation costs. And it will be especially risky to do something now at a last minute. It would pose an even greater security risk to try to roll out something like this that is such a security vulnerability in such a short period of time, and would create an open invitation to hackers who, as we already know, are working to try to interfere in our election. So we really recommend against that and think that there are better ways of providing access, and we need to use all of them, but only the ones that we know we can do with good securities in place.
Very good. And any further thoughts on during the spring primary? There are roughly 400,000 people in Wisconsin voted in person. Voters encountered long lines as well as inaccessible and closed polling places. Any other thoughts on this? Social distancing measures were put in place. Several polling workers and in-person voters tested positive for the virus after election day. Couldn't transmitted virus to others. And Leadership Conference studied the election, at least in part. What are the lessons learned from Wisconsin primary, from your perspective?
Sure, thank you for that question. So in Wisconsin, politicians refused to allow the primary to be postponed and challenged common sense efforts to make it easier for Wisconsin voters to cast their ballot during the pandemic, like extending the deadlines to vote and waiving the witness signature requirement for absentee ballots, which is almost an impossible hurdle for many voters who are confined to their homes by stay-at-home orders. And the Leadership Conference has a campaign called All Voting is Local, and we worked with Demos to draft an analysis that's available on our website called COVID-19 Silenced Voters of Color in Wisconsin. And in that report, we found that average voter turnout in Black and Hispanic wards was 30 percentage points lower than average voter turnout in white wards. Widespread poll closures occurred in places like Milwaukee, which is home to 60% of Wisconsin's Black voters and almost 30% of the state's Hispanic voters. And in Milwaukee alone, officials decreased the number of polling locations from 180 to just 5, causing voters to stand in line for hours. I wanted to mention one poll worker story that our All Voting is Local campaign uncovered in Wisconsin. There was a poll worker named Emily Bell who described suiting up in protective gear that she had brought from her own home to serve as at one of Milwaukee's only remaining polling locations. And she spent the day informing voters, mostly African American voters, who had stood in line for 2 to 3 hours, that they had to go to another location in order to cast their ballot. And she knew that many would not be able to vote, that they were due back at work or unable to get to the correct location before the polls closed at 8 p.m. on election day. And this is really what voter disenfranchisement looks like in 2020. And brave poll workers are wearing PPE. They're on the front lines to make sure that people have the right to vote in our country this year.
Thank you, Ms. And I understand that Ms. Underwood, Councilwoman Underwood, has to a hard stop at 4, so I'm going to stop there and yield to her, and then I'll go after that.
Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Langevin. I want to sincerely thank both of our panelists, Ms. Winsley Weiser of the Brennan Center for Justice and Ms. Chapman of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Free and fair elections are the foundation of our democracy. The federal government must ensure that every American is able to safely exercise the right to vote, even in a pandemic. Our committee is so grateful for your willingness to share your expertise with us today as we continue our work on this urgent issue. And I'd also like to thank my colleague, Mr. Langevin, for hosting the conversation. I know you probably do have some wrap-up comments that you want to offer, but I'll yield back to Mr. Langevin to wrap up. Thank you all.
Very good. Thank you, my colleague, and sorry that in the beginning that I had to go right to you after I spoke. I had some other talking points in front of me that I wasn't sure if you were going to be able to make it on. I know you were on a very important conference call with the Congressional Black Caucus just before this one, so got it all worked out. We get everything in. So, well, I want to. I'll just. I think most of the topics have been covered that I wanted to address with my panelists today, and I'm grateful for your input. And I hope our viewers get out of this briefing as well. So. With that, I am prepared to close unless there were anything else from our panelists that you'd like to include. Very good. Well, with that, I just want to thank everyone for being on this briefing today. Obviously, we have our challenges going forward. We are going to be dealing with the COVID-19 for the foreseeable future until we have a vaccine or antivirals that develop that will help treat the most severe complications of the virus. In the meantime, we have an election, and we have coming up. We have business to run, and we need to make sure that we're working on that and getting everything done effectively, and make sure that every vote is counted. Your input is incredibly helpful, and with that, I'm sure it's going to help guide the committee going forward, making sure that we make sure that our states have the things that they need, and everything else is done to make sure that elections every vote is counted and they're effective. So with that, I'm going to stop there, and I want to again thank our panelists for your input today. And with that, I yield back and we'll stop. So. Thank you all very much. And